Welcome to our Administrator Mentorship Program. Today, our first session of many will be best practices on user and role management. Today, it's going to be hosted by myself, Matt Connery, and we have our panelists, Leah Lipska and Amber Haney, discussing the best practices for admin mentorship. All right, just a little bit about myself. I started here at Go Virtual Office back in early 2022. I've got a background in e-commerce and website administration. I'm a functional consultant on the Boost team, and some of my passions include playing with my youngest daughter, Catherine, and camping with my wife and 2 dogs. And then we have Leah.
Hi, Leah Lipska. I've been here at Go Virtual Office since 2016. I'm actually coming up on my 8-year anniversary here next month. I have a background in marketing and web, as well as manufacturing and process and policy. I'm a functional lead consultant here on the Boost team, and I have 4 children and a husband. And my passions are my kids' soccer teams, being on the PTO, and serving on the Mount Horeb Board of Education.
All right. And Amber.
Hi, I'm Amber Haney. I also started at GVO in 2022. My background includes inventory management, sales, ERP consulting, and I was an administrator for 5 years. I'm a technical consultant on the Boost team, and I enjoy working out, reading, painting, and exploring nature with my family.
Great, thanks so much. All right, and before we get started here, we just want to go over our Safe Pasture statement, which we share on all of our presentations, which are just here to remind the audience that we go off of NetSuite's best practices, but that we understand that each account is unique to each client, and they contain different modules and functionalities. So it really varies depending on which edition you have. So we take all of that into account when we go through our demonstrations and work with our clients. And we also really highly recommend that when you're doing any testing and validating, make sure you do that within your sandbox environment if you have one. Before you push anything to production, it's going to save you a lot of heartache and potential mistakes by making sure that you validate and go through proper UAT before you move to production. All right, and with that, we are going to dive into our first topic. We're going to go through users and access, provisioning access as an admin. We're going to go into some of our best practices regarding onboarding and offboarding. We'll go through user management at a high level and talk a little bit more about role permissions and role creation, which is really going to kind of dive into how to compartmentalize and keep certain regions of NetSuite in your account hidden from certain employees that may not need to have that sort of visibility. And then also provisioning access to work with certain fields and regions within NetSuite, where somebody like a controller might have different access than somebody like a store manager, or somebody that works in the warehouse may have different access from somebody like an administrator. So we're going to go through all that at a high level, and we hope that you learned something from this session.
Thanks for covering that, Matt. So let's just kick this off with user access. So from an administrator perspective, you are probably familiar with the 2 different types of access, but we're going to dig into it a little bit further because coming from the admin background, sometimes you get a little confused by it. So they're called full access users or employee access users. And a full access user allows you to assign roles and give higher permissions. This license is typically reserved for the more in-depth tasks within NetSuite because they can have access to the whole system. Whereas within the employee access user, this means that they can only access the system to enter and track like their time and their projects, and they don't have the in-depth ERP functionalities that would come from the full access user. So again, with some of our best practices here, users that would need to complete access would need complete access to NetSuite for those managerial, administrative tasks, including seeing the financials and possibly customizing the system. Those users you would want to have full access license so they can make sure that they can do and touch all the pieces and parts of NetSuite. And then as a best practice for the employee access, these would be individuals or employees who only need to perform specific job functions without needing access to the customization piece or seeing any financial information. Leah, did you have anything to add on that, or you good?
Nope, that was great. Thank you.
All right, now I do have a few use cases. Sometimes it's helpful to see an example. So from a employee access standpoint, this would be useful for sales representatives if they need to access customer records, just create sales orders and view only their information, and they don't need to see the financial details. As well as maybe inventory managers. They can manage the inventory levels, create purchase orders, update item records, but they don't need to have access to payroll or financial management features. The permissions that are associated with the employee access user surround view and edit of specific records. Again, the limited access to financial and sensitive information, and they cannot modify and a lot of times cannot view at all the administrative tools. So again, within the employee access, this is a very limited access into the NetSuite environment, which is useful to ensure that they are focused solely on their day-to-day tasks without being able to modify the overarching system preferences or settings. We also have a use case here for the full access user. Again, this is the one that would have full access to the entire environment. And you typically see this for financial controllers, obviously administrators, and then another example would be executives, because they might need to see some of that high level financial information, and in order to do that, they would need that full access into all the financial data so that they can view the KPIs and just see all of those reports that they may be asking for. And additionally, for the controller aspect, they are obviously in the financial area, but it also allows them to create budgets. And a lot of times we do see they're managing some of those accounting processes and maybe some of those accounting preferences. And it's a little bit easier for them to make any of those changes versus maybe having to go through an administrator. So it would be good for them to also have full access. Again, just to cover permissions from that full access, it's access to all modules and records. They can view and modify financial data. They have access to those customizations within the system as well as administrative settings, and they can change them, as well as can create and manage other user accounts. All right, so next up, we've talked about the full licenses and the employee centers, but how do you know which ones you have, how many you are using in your account? So I'm going to just jump into a demo account quick to go through these navigation steps to show you where that is in your account from an administrator role. So if you go up to your setup, company, and then scroll, it's like all the way down at the bottom, view billing information. Right on this first billable components tab, you can see here you've got employee center, and you can see current provisioned quantity is 5, which means in your account you have access to use up to 5. And right now the current in use, oops, don't get clicky, is 0. So you have 5, but no one has been assigned those. So you have 5 available that you can assign out. And then you can see the full license user list here, and there are 10 that are provisioned in the environment and 6 are currently in use. So 6 have been assigned out to employees, which means you have 4 available to add as needed. So So you can see here, just reviewing that billable components area to locate these lists. It's very helpful if you just need to see if you're onboarding a new employee, which segues nicely into our next discussion. But if you're onboarding a new employee, to decide if you need to purchase more licenses or not based on what you have available. All right, so next up we have some onboarding and offboarding best practices. So some onboarding best practices would be, when you're creating that employee record, obviously ensuring that you're filling out all the mandatory fields. You check under this access sub-tab, you check the give access box, which allows them in the entry of the NetSuite system. So if that give access box is not checked, but you've created the employee record, they still can't get into NetSuite. You will also be required to assign a role. And we say proper role, it is all dependent upon the employee record that you're creating, what kind of role that they would need. We'll be discussing roles in a couple of minutes, but make sure you assign a role and to ensure that they can complete all their day-to-day tasks. We recommend that you manually assign the first password to be some sort of temporary password that meets the password criteria over here on the right, but that you then check the require password change on next login. So you have to check this manually assign, then you can fill out that password, then you check the require password change on next login. So what happens then is, when you have filled out all these checkboxes and you hit save, when that user logs in using the temporary password that you've provided to them, they will immediately be prompted to another screen that asks them to fill out their own password. And the reason that we recommend this, or it's a best practice, is because it allows ease of entry on their first sign-on so that they can easily get into the account, and then it puts the responsibility on the user to manage their own passwords. Oh, I forgot to mention, you want to check this send notification email so that they can get that email so they can log in. And this password criteria also is helpful just to note if they are trying to save their password. If they don't have any special characters or things like that, they'll have some issues. Now, offboarding. So whenever you're offboarding an employee, you want to first verify that that login is not tied to any integrations. So we have a few ways that you can check this, but again, it's going to be based on your account and how you guys typically set those up. But typically the integration connection will be identified through certain roles. You can see an example here for some SPS Commerce integrations, as well as on the role itself, there's a box called Web Services Only. This doesn't mean that it always is checked to indicate that it is an integration, but it could have that checked, and that is a good indicator. Next up, you want to remove the employee access. So as we just mentioned on the last slide, when you check the give access box, it allows them entry into the system, and when you uncheck it, it revokes that access. So best practice, you can uncheck that give access box as soon as that employee is terminated to ensure that they cannot access your NetSuite environment. But before you mark the employee inactive, it's best to go in and reassign any tasks that they have, any projects or transactions if they are a sales rep. Because once you check that inactive box on their employee record, they're no longer available in drop-down lists, and it becomes a little bit more difficult to reassign things. So this is kind of listed out in like an order of operations per se, that the last thing you want to do after you've checked through all these other bits is to check that inactive box, and then that shows that they are no longer in lists, and they'll no longer be able to have new things assigned to them. All right, next up we've got some user management information. So In the day-to-day life of an administrator, you have some common issues that arise. And so surrounding that, we have a few best practices related to those issues, such as like password changes and security questions. So those best practices are really, again, making sure that users are resetting their password on the first login to kind of put that responsibility on the user to manage, as well as for an overall company preference is having strong password requirements. This will protect your account a little bit better. I believe the system defaults to the image that I have in the upper right of just strong minimum password length, and then the password expiration is 180. But you can change those as an admin, and if you'd like to make that the password policy details different, making sure the passwords are longer or that they're having to cycle out and reset their password more frequently, that's something that can be helpful from your day-to-day life. And then another really important call out is, when possible, have the users reset their own password. You know, typically I remember that my day-to-day, you'd have a couple, 2, 3, hey, I forgot my password, you know, what is it? And if you're continually having to reset those passwords, the user then also has to reset their saved security questions. But if the user can reset their own password, then those security questions are retained. The security answers are retained. So then they don't have to reset that too, which again just helps with the day-to-day of getting your team into the account. So let's talk about the resetting of those passwords. So there's a few different ways to do it, and I have it divided out here by user-led or admin-led. So for the user-led, if the user is logged in and they want to change their password, on their dashboard in the settings portlet, there is a change password setting link that they can just go in right there and change their password. But a lot of times that's not the case. Usually they can't get in. And if that's the situation, then they can just navigate to the NetSuite login page, and NetSuite has that forgot your password link. So all they would need to do is enter their email and then click that forgot password, and that'll take them through the steps of resetting their password. That way you don't have to reset those security questions. But if for some reason they cannot get there, they're having some other issue, and they're like, can you please just reset it so I can, quickly get into the account? Then you will navigate to that user's employee record. You'll check the manually assign or change password. And again, assigning some sort of temporary password. I typically do like today temp and today's date and the special character of an exclamation, because that is a quick way for me to know that I'm going to meet all of the password criterias. And then once again, check that require password change on next login to ensure that they are resetting the temporary password. I would also recommend that whenever you're discussing the change with them, to let them know that they will need to reset their security answers as well. And on this side, we have the more details about the security questions. So again, in the settings portlet on their dashboard, if they are logged in, they have a way to update their security questions. And then they can select new questions and provide those answers. We do recommend also that they save that somewhere or print it out. I think mine's saved on my computer desktop or something, so that I can easily get to it if I need to. And then on the admin side, we cannot directly reset those security questions. So again, it will have to be on the user side. So again, when those passwords are reset, those security questions and answers are erased, and just notifying the user of, hey, I've reset your password, you're going to be prompted to reset your security questions. I will say also, this is a really nice tip to call out for your team if they are trying to log in and having some issues, is the security question answer area is not case sensitive. So I know a lot of times it's like, oh, I capitalized the first letter or something like that. But on the security answers, the case doesn't matter. So it's nice to tell your team not to waste an attempt by changing characters to a different case. All right, well, that is all I'm covering from the user side. I'm going to kick it over to Leah, and she's going to talk to you about some roles.
Yes. All right, so we're going to talk about role creation. All right, so when you're creating a role, where do you start? You want to start with an out-of-the-box role. Creating roles from scratch can be very time-consuming. So if you can find a role in NetSuite that matches similar to what you want to do and then tweak it from there, it's going to save you a lot of time. You can use the show role differences to compare roles. And so Amber, I don't know if you want to bring that up so we can show that quick. But you're going to go into setup, you're going to go down to user roles, and you're going to go to show role differences. And then from there, you're going to pick the base role that you want to use. And it doesn't matter which order you pick these in. So don't stress over which one's the base and which ones you're comparing to. So in this case, we're going to compare the accountant role with the GVO accountant role. And there's the checkbox on the side where you can show the role differences or have it show you everything. Showing you everything's probably not beneficial, but in some cases it could be. So then you click show, and it's gonna, normally you see a lot more things than this, but this is a demo account. So in this case, the only difference between our accountant role and our GVO accountant role is that the GVO accountant role, we didn't give them access to the work calendar. You can export this role either as a CSV or an Excel file if you needed to do some comparing. This is also great for troubleshooting if one role can do something and another role can't, trying to figure out which permissions are missing. All right, we can hop back to the PowerPoint. All right, so once you have your base role, you want to rename it. We always recommend using your company abbreviation, in our case GVO, and then the name of the role. And you want that to be very kind of specific. So if it's a view only role, put view only in it. It's going to save you time in the future. You will be very excited and you're like, oh, this is a view only role. This isn't the one I want. I want the full user role or whatever. It's gonna be helpful to you. And then you want to set the ID. Again, we also recommend using your 3 digits and then the name of the role. And then once you have that new role created, inactivate the out-of-the-box role that you're not going to use. It's going to clean up your list of roles and make sure that nobody accidentally gets assigned a role that you don't want them to have. And also, very importantly, and we'll cover this in a little bit, but review all the permissions, because a lot of out-of-the-box roles that NetSuite creates, the permissions are set to full, and full can be very scary in the wrong hands. Oh, another quick call out. Dashboards will not carry over from your out-of-the-box role. So if your accountant role has a dashboard and you make a copy to the GVO accountant role, the dashboard is lost. You'll have to recreate one. We will be covering dashboards at a future session. So NetSuite has a lot of different center types. There's a long list here, and there's a link down below with more information that will get sent out. But this is going to determine, your center determines which things are where on your dashboard. So it might group different sales things together in the sales role, and the accountant role might have that same functionality, but it might be grouped in a different section. So it's really NetSuite's way of trying to group activities by role to make them easier to find and best suited for the role. So the most common ones that we see are the Accounting Center and the Classic Center. The Accounting Center is the one in the back, and the Classic Center is the one in the front. You also have the option in your own personal preferences, which if you go to Little House and you go to set preferences, you can set your view to classic mode. We do have clients who do this. They know how to find stuff that way, and that's how they like it, and the other way doesn't make sense to them. And that's perfectly an acceptable way to do that. But this just shows that there's different ways to set that up. All right, now you can go to the next one. All right, so what to avoid when creating roles. Avoid the catch-all full access roles. Do not give somebody a role that can do everything and then assign it to everyone, because then all of your separation of duties goes out the window. A good rule of thumb is that an employee should be able to complete all of their steps for the day with one single role, because flipping back and forth can be quite frustrating to users. And you really want to make sure you have separation of duties. So if you are an AP person, you shouldn't be able to do AR and vice versa. There are times where that is not an option. You're a tiny company of 5 and that's not an option. Then you might want to look at putting in approval routings and things like that to help with the separation of duties. But these catch-all roles and full access roles should be very, very limited. Also, for assigning administrators, you should have 1 or 2 staff as administrators. All 8 of your staff should not be administrators, because you can do things like delete all data or close the account, things like that. So you want 1 or 2 people, and 2 is probably better in case somebody's on vacation, something needs to change, but depending on how many staff you have, that'll depend on how many you want, but no more than 2 is best practice. All right, so now we're going to dive into those permissions. So there are 4 types of permissions, 5 if you count none, but so you're going to have your view, which means that they can read anything. You'll have create, which means they can create a record, they can view, but they can't edit. So if you give them create to a sales order, they type in the sales order, they hit save, and they're like, oh, I forgot to update this field. They cannot edit it. Someone else would have to edit it for them. They can only create and view. And then for edit, you can see this is building in this beautiful little graphic here, that with edit, you can view, and you can create. And then so the next level up from that is full. We really recommend that you are careful on who has full access, because you can delete, and you can have somebody who goes in, creates an invoice, deletes the invoice, and then somebody's like, wait a minute, where did this invoice go? I was just looking at it yesterday. Well, if you have full access, you can delete. So you want to use that very, very sparsely. There is a link down here in this file. NetSuite puts out an Excel spreadsheet every upgrade with the permissions, what they mean, and what levels they come in, because there are some permissions that come in none or full. Those are your only options. And in that case, if you want them to have access, they have to have full. So that's the different levels. So now we get into all of the other different restrictions and things that you can set up on a role. So we're going to kind of start at the top and kind of work our way around here. So the first one is employee restrictions. Out of the box, that's going to come to none, no default, which means it's not restricted by employee. You can then restrict to none, default to own, which means there's still no restriction, but it's just going to default to things you've created when you go view. Then you can restrict to own, subordinates, and unassigned. So this is going to restrict you from seeing transactions that are yours, anybody who is listed as your employee in NetSuite, and anything that didn't get assigned to someone specifically. So there's no sales rep on it, you could see it. And then there's own and subordinate only, which is the same as above, except if it's unassigned, you're not going to see it. This can be a little tricky because, especially with sales staff, where they're like, oh, I need to be able to see this because that's so-and-so created. Well, depending on how this is set up, they might not be able to see that. So it's something to really think about how you want to restrict that access. So now we're going to go over to the checkboxes over on the right. So the first one is do not restrict employee fields. So this one allows users with this role that has this checked to select any employee in a, or I'm sorry, yes, when it's checked to not, it's a not, So it allows them to select an employee in an employee field. So a sales manager could select a sales rep in the sales rep field, even if that sales rep is part of a different team. You can also restrict time and expenses. This would allow employees to only be enter time on their behalf, along with expense reports. The next checkbox there is the sales role. When this is checked, then when you are trying to assign sales teams, that employee will be in the list. So 98.9% of the time when an employee doesn't show up, it's because this checkbox isn't assigned on the role. So this role isn't a sales role. Then if you go to the next one, support roles. So this role could be assigned on cases if you use cases in NetSuite. The next one is the partner role. Same thing. They could be assigned in the partner center. And then the last one is the core administrative permissions. This one, use with caution. There is not a lot of actual documentation on what this role does, but it does allow administrator-like permissions. So if that's checked on a role, one of the things I've seen it be able to do is update someone else's calendar in NetSuite. I've seen it be able to update save searches that aren't your own. So there's not a lot documented on what it does and doesn't do, so use it with extreme caution. So now we'll jump down to the subsidiary restrictions. For clients who have multiple subsidiaries, this is really important. So this role can have access to all subsidiaries. It can have access to only active subsidiaries. It can have access to the user subsidiary, which means it's going to look at the employee record and see what subsidiaries on that employee, and they'll only be able to see anything with that subsidiary. And then selected, if you have multiple and you click that, you'll get a little multi-select, and you can say, oh, I want this one and this one, but not this one. And then that allow cross-subsidiary viewing can allow users to view different records, but they wouldn't be able to, even if they had edit permissions, they wouldn't be able to edit that specific transaction if it's not in their subsidiary. So now we'll jump down to that authentication section. So the first one is the single sign-on. I have never used this. We recommend that you use the SAML permission instead. The next one is the web services only role. This is the one Amber referenced earlier. So what this does is this prohibits this role from accessing the UI. So if I have this role and I log into NetSuite, I won't see it. It allows it to only be used by a web service, like an API call. This is, again, a really good best practice is if this role is specifically for integrations, is to check that box as long as the integration still works. We have seen integrations where when that's checked, the integration will fail. So you want to make sure you test that out very, very carefully before you go and check that checkbox. However, if something were to fail, you can uncheck it, no harm, no foul, and it'll let you log into that role again. The last one on this list is restrict this role by device ID. So this is not used very often, but you could restrict by IP address. We don't really use it because depending on your internet provider, your IP could change. So it's not something we've seen used often, but it has been used there are use cases for it. All right, so we're going to move on to the next one here. We're going to talk about two-factor authentication. So over there on the right, you have your two-factor authentication required. It's going to default to not required. And I'll have a call out about that in just a minute, but it defaults to not required. The other option is to make it required, or there's RSA two-factor authentication required, and that's for roles and users with associated RSA secure ID tokens. If you set the two-factor to be required, then you also want to set the duration of trusted device. So that can be per session, which means anytime they'd log out, they'd have to log back in with 2FA. And you can set it from anywhere from a minimum, I think, of 4 hours to up to 30 days. So there are some roles that once you give specific permissions, it's going to require 2FA even if you're saying you don't want 2FA required. There are certain accounting permissions where it makes it required. We don't have those listed here, but they are out in Suite Answers. Another call out, because Amber talked a lot about setting up security questions. If you are using 2FA, you cannot also set up security questions. We do get calls about this quite often. They're like, hey, my users can't set up their security questions. Yep, as soon as you enable 2FA, 2FA is more secure, so you don't need the security questions on top. All right, move on to the next one. We're going to talk about global permissions. So global permissions are done on the employee's record. This is something that you can assign specifically to that employee only. This is not best practice. You want to assign them by role. They're easier to manage. However, there are permissions that warrant the global permissions. For example, the published dashboards. You might not want everybody with the role of X, Y, and Z to be able to publish dashboards, but you really want Amber to be able to publish them. You can go to her employee record, give that global permission, and then she can do it, but no one else in her role can. This is also a good call out if you have users who are like, well, Amber and I are in the same role and she can do this and I can't, and I don't understand why. Check global permissions, because most likely somebody has one and somebody doesn't. So use it with caution, but it is there as an option. All right. You're up, Matt.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. That was really informative. We learned a lot about how to manage your users, onboarding and offboarding, and best practices surrounding permissions today. So thank you both. Going forward in these sessions, we are also going to have an associated homework. So don't freak out. We're not going to grade you on this, but this is just something that we feel is going to be very beneficial to follow up in our next meeting. So each month we're going to have one topic. In the first meeting, we're going to have a structure much like we did today, where we go through and show the UI and talk about specific topics. And then in the second session, we're actually going to go over and review the homework prompt that we deliver in the first session. So for today, our questions to you are, how many full access users do you currently have in your account? How many do you have available? Do you have any full access roles? And do you run any role difference comparisons for similarly named roles? So for this, we're not expecting you to send us any of the results or anything like that, but we would like to ask that you have this prepared ahead of the next meeting so that we can really go over some of the pain points or roadblocks that you may have run into in trying to solve these homework questions. And in that, we can go over some of the aspects in your account if you have any specific questions, or if you would like to simply absorb this homework, not necessarily answer it, and then attend that session and learn what others in the community have to say, you can also go about it that way. So it's no pressure. It's meant to benefit you as the user. All right. So if you do want more knowledge, we have a full Boost community full of plenty of resources, specifically in the admin mentorship. You can see our upcoming events. For example, our next meeting, which is our homework follow-up, will be on Wednesday, June 26th at the same time. So get that on your calendar today. And we're going to have some best practice videos and some content that we'll upload that we'll be able to share with you that you can use to help onboarding with your employees, or if you have any specific questions for our admins here, you can always ask questions within the community. We'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. Again, we're going to have more videos to come as we go through the topics, and you can sign up and tell your friends and fellow employees to sign up via the link below. And if you have any ideas for a topic, please let us know. We want this community to be really interactive. Feel free to use the chats when you come back to our next sessions. We want everybody to get involved and share their ideas. All right. Well, thank you all for your time today. We really appreciate it. If you have any questions, feel free to email us at the link below. And with that, thank you so much for your time today, and I hope you have a great day.